The idea of this video is to give you some key points about Belfast Confetti that you should be able to remember in the exam, even though you won't have the poem in front of you. I'm going to use an acronym to aid memory, and that acronym is SPIT, which breaks down into some thoughts about structure and form, point of view, imagery and theme. So when you get into the exam, then what I'd like you to do is spit all over whichever poem it is that you have to write about. So here's an analysis of Belfast Confetti using SPIT. Let's start by listening to the poem though. This is a reading by the poet himself, so Carson's own voice. Here we go.
Belfast Confetti. Suddenly, as the riot squad moved in, it was raining exclamation marks, nuts, bolts, nails, car keys, a fount of broken type, and the explosion itself an asterisk on the map. This hyphenated line, a burst of rapid fire. I was trying to complete a sentence in my head, but it kept stuttering, all the alleyways and side streets blocked with stops and colons. I know this labyrinth so well, Balaclava, Raglan, Inkerman, Odessa Street, why can't I escape? Every move is punctuated. Crimea Street, dead end again. A Saracen, Kremlin to mesh, Macrolon face shields, walkie-talkies. What is my name? Where am I coming from? Where am I going? A fusillade of question marks.
This is the first of two stanzas in the poem. The second is slightly shorter, not much, and you can see at a glance that it's written in free verse. We don't have compact stanzas that are following any kind of rules here. We have instead lines that seem to be overlong, words isolated on their own because they've spilled across. And Carson is doing this, of course, because he is depicting in this poem the chaos of conflict. The form of the poem, therefore, is chaotic. It's like the poem itself has been exploded, just as Carson is describing the impact of an explosion and a riot. Think about the title of the poem too, Belfast Confetti. Confetti, when it's thrown, can't be constrained to form a particular pattern, can it? And it's as if these words also have been thrown, exploded onto the page. There's deep irony here that we'll explore later too, because confetti obviously we associate with love and marriage, and not shrapnel, which is the confetti that's raining down on people in this poem. So that image of confetti, which is reinforced by the very shape of the poem, is also a bitterly ironic comment on all that's wrong with Belfast. You do need to remember that this poem is set during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This was a period of time when the IRA fought to end British rule in Northern Ireland. You'll have heard it from the reading that Carson is an Irish poet. He grew up in Northern Ireland, so his childhood was marked by all of this violence, and you can see from the graphic here just how many deaths there were in Belfast City. So a strong sense of the madness of all of this is evoked in the poem, which we'll now look at a little bit more closely. We move on to looking at point of view now, and here's the second stanza that I didn't show you earlier. It begins, I know this labyrinth so well, and then we get street names. So clearly this is a first person poem, I, and the speaker in the poem is a local. He knows Belfast really well, can name the streets. It's interesting, therefore, that he should refer to it as a labyrinth, even though he does know it well, and that conveys a sense of the frightening nature of Belfast. A labyrinth is a maze-like place, isn't it, from Greek mythology, and there's a monster lives at the centre of a labyrinth. That could be a reference to the violence at the heart of Belfast, a city that seems to be consuming its own people. It's important to note that the streets that the speaker mentions in the poem are all connected with the Crimean War in some way. Balaclava, Raglan, Inkerman, Crimea Street. That's a reminder, perhaps, that the current violence in Northern Ireland isn't just a modern phenomenon. War, conflict, is part of British history, and there's maybe a sense of bitterness in that. So it's a first-person poem. The speaker is a local, and he's named some of the streets of Belfast. Obviously, I've analysed that a little, so I'm already beginning to look at imagery. We've looked at the labyrinth, we've looked at the street names. What other key images then are there in this poem? Well, starting with the two big pictures. This is the first stanza, and what's being described in the past tense is a riot. The riot squad has just moved in, obviously trying to restore order, and a scene of violence and chaos is depicted. Within that, we've got the speaker referring to himself and his inability to form a sentence in his own head. So he's caught up in this chaos and he can't think straight, he can't even speak. And we've already talked about the way the form of the poem captures that idea of chaos and confusion and disorder. So that's the first stanza. The big picture is there's a riot going on, the speaker is caught up in it. Interestingly, the second stanza shifts into the present tense. The speaker, as we know, has tried to escape. He's running through the streets of Belfast but getting nowhere, and he runs into security forces. Let's look a little bit more closely at the image of the security forces. Here's the quotation: "A Saracen Kremlin 2 mesh." Now that's a huge, great tank. Makaton face shields, walkie-talkies. So the security forces are described by a series of parts, things. This makes them appear faceless, and we get a sense of the imbalance of power. The speaker is completely overwhelmed, lost for words, can't answer any of the simple questions that is asked by the security forces. There's the face shields there. You see how dehumanizing they are, and it's a very dehumanizing image. The very short, stark sentences also add to the aggression of this image. The short, punchy, blunt sentence is a feature of this poem, and the last two lines are no exception. This time the sentences take the form of questions. Questions the speaker doesn't seem capable of answering, which again creates a sense of chaos, his confusion. A brilliantly powerful image to end the poem, a fusillade of question marks. Now, a fusillade is a volley of bullets from more than one weapon. So these questions are being experienced by the speaker as bullets. They're being fired at him by this faceless force in front of him. Also reinforced here is the idea, which I'm going to explore in some depth now, of language represented by punctuation marks, how we organise language in its written form, language becoming an enemy in this poem. So just as now question marks are bullets at the start of the poem, exclamation marks are bits of shrapnel flying around. This is a really important strand of imagery, and perhaps Carson is saying that language in this situation is used in an inflammatory way. It's not used to negotiate peace, find solutions. It's used to inflame the situation. So that could be why elements of the violent scene are compared to punctuation marks throughout the poem. I'll give you a few examples of that now. The explosion itself, an asterisk on the map. You'll see from that visual image there how an asterisk does resemble an explosion, something exploding outwards. And notice too the use of enjambment there, the way the phrase "the explosion itself" is broken over 3 lines. This emphasises the idea of things falling apart, as I said at the start when we looked at the use of free verse in this poem and how important that is to its meaning. This hyphenated line, a burst of rapid fire, again we've got this idea of the straight line of the hyphen resembling the straight line of a bullet. Perhaps the ... the ellipsis at the end also evokes a series of bullets. Elsewhere in the poem we have roadblocks described as stops and colons. We have a tremendously powerful image in a fount of broken type. So the idea there of letters being exploded into the air in a kind of fountain of nonsense. I've already mentioned the question marks at the end of the poem. Every move is punctuated, said the poet. So language is a really important theme in this poem. You've got to explore it if you're writing about it. And this here is a key quotation relating to language. The poet says, "I was trying to complete a sentence in my head, but it kept stuttering." Notice the enjambment again. We've always got a stutter, a break in the line. So the speaker in the poem has lost his ability to form coherent sentences anymore. He can't find the words to shape them. That's his personal experience as he describes it in the poem. And we've seen that on a broader level, language seems to have broken down. It seems to have become a weapon, part of the conflict, something that keeps it going, something that fuels bitterness and hatred and violence and bloodshed. So the imagery in the poem is absolutely central to one of its major themes, which is the breakdown of language and communication. On its simplest level then, this is a poem about a demonstration in Belfast City during the Troubles. The demonstration has got out of hand and riot police have moved in. There's shrapnel flying about everywhere. The protesters are throwing things. There's also an explosion. The speaker in the poem tries to escape, but he can't find his way out, even though this is his home city. It's a confusing place. It's like a labyrinth. And he finally runs into a checkpoint where he's questioned. Confusion is a major theme in the poem. It's the predominant experience of the speaker. We don't know what side he's on, whether he's a Catholic or Protestant. He doesn't share his views. He's just simply conveying a sense of the chaos of the situation and himself caught up in it. And it's this confusion which is very powerfully evoked at the end of the poem when we get a series of questions with no answers. The use of the present tense as well means that the poem isn't resolved at the end. We're there in the moment with this poet at the checkpoint, and we don't know what the future holds for him, where he's going to be next, whether he did escape. There's a great sense of uncertainty at the end of the poem. So that's a major theme, as well as I've already emphasised, as the idea of language being a weapon, language being part of the problem, being inflammatory. There's a sense of despair about that idea as well. And in the second stanza, Carson says, "Dead end again." He's referring to his attempt to escape out of the riot zone, but perhaps as well he's suggesting the lack of any sense of moving towards a solution, just dead ends. Because, of course, you can only negotiate a peace when you're using language for negotiation rather than to inflame hatred and tear communities apart.